Thank you so much for being with us this morning. To provide a little bit of an introduction, Dr. Kalika Konda is an assistant professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a research associate at the Cayetano Heredia University in Lima, Peru. She has lived and worked in Lima since 2004, focusing on HIV and STI prevention research with gay men and transgender women. Dr. Konda received her PhD in infectious disease epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. She has received various training awards, including the Department of Epidemiology's Mary Meyer Scholarship and the NIH F31 Ruth L. Kirsten NRSA Predoctoral Fellowship. She then completed Dr. Tom Coates' 8032 postdoctoral fellowship in global health at UCLA and is currently the recipient of the NIMH funded KO1 entitled Assessing How Relationships Between MSM Influence HIV Prevention Strategies. At UPCH, Dr. Konda works at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Sexuality, Society, and AIDS. Dr. Konda has published more than 60 peer-reviewed articles on HIV, STI, epidemiology, sexuality and sexual behavior, gay couples, and serodisclosure. Thank you, Dr. Konda. I'm going to let you start your presentation now.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm going to try to share my screen, and please let me know if that works. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes, we can.
Yes? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my career and how it's been so far. And Kimberly actually let me know last week that I'm the first GloCal alumni that's presenting in this series. So that's kind of fun. It's nice to have things come full circle. So I was a recipient of GloCal back in 2013, and I've been a mentor for several GloCal fellows since then, including Vincent this year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my career trajectory, and that will be part of it. And I made a few slides, but really I want this to be more of a conversation. So please feel free to interrupt me whenever, and we can just talk a little bit about what your interests are as well, how things fit together, and probably so this is a little bit of my career trajectory, and probably one of the things that's different about me is that I've really lived and worked in Peru since I was in my master's program. So I moved to Peru in June of 2004, and other than 2 9-month periods for classwork during my PhD, this is where I've been. So that provides me with, I've been here for more than 14 years now, and am very much incorporated within the university here at Cayetano. I do continue to work with UCLA and for UCLA, but really my time is here. I haven't actually been to LA since about 2016, at least. So most of what I do is really here. So you can see from my career trajectory, I went to college. I did not study anything health related, which is confusing here in Peru, where for the most part, if you are an epidemiologist, the idea is that you would have started your career as a medical doctor. And medical doctors, as in much of the world, in contrast to the US, start their careers in undergrad, not in graduate school. So it's very confusing here that my college degree is in environmental sciences. People always ask me, well, what are you? What did you do? And they mean in college, and my college career has absolutely nothing to do with what I do now. But then I did Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic, and I was interested in both HIV prevention and health. And that during my Peace Corps career, although I was there to do environmental education, I ended up doing a lot more health education, and most of that was related to HIV prevention. So while I was in Peace Corps, I applied for master's programs and ended up going to Johns Hopkins for a master's in social and behavioral interventions in international health. And part of that was because I was still at that point a little bit scared of the statistical side of things. I wasn't really sure that that was going to be something I was interested in or something that I could do. So my master's thesis is much more about social and behavioral interventions and doing qualitative work for the development of those interventions. And I do continue to use those qualitative skills, although at this point I do much more quantitative research and epidemiology. After my master's, I worked in Peru for a year. So the group that I did my master's with is actually the group that I continue to work with. They've morphed a little bit and changed as things do, and they're now a center at the university instead of being an institute. But I continue to work with the same group of people. And right after my master's, I basically just started working with them. I took over the interview or the survey portion, the assessment for a large clinical trial, and worked on that for a year before I went back and did my doctorate. And I did my doctorate in infectious disease epidemiology at Hopkins, but I continued to work in Peru, and my dissertation was in Peru. And as Paul mentioned, I got an F-31 to finish my dissertation work, and which was great because I had support and funding to be able to work in Peru to complete my dissertation. And then I did a postdoc, which it was an NIH-supported T32 run by Tom Coates out of UCLA. So I did that from 2010 to 2013. And part of what I've done in the midst of all of this is a lot of teaching and mentoring. And I think in health, I mean, one of the things that ends up happening with research is almost as soon as you are out of one bracket of career, time, you're mentoring people who are within that. So I think I completed my master's, and then the next year or the following year, I was mentoring master's students. I completed my PhD and was almost immediately mentoring PhD students. And that continues to happen. And you just have to kind of make time for it and learn as you go. I don't think there's really any other way to do it. And what I've done in terms of teaching is we have a master's program and a doctoral program here at Cayetano in investigative epidemiology. And I've taught the 4-course epidemiology series since 2008, and the doctoral program started in 2016, so I now teach the doctoral students as well. And we also host a month-long global health program for UCLA undergrad students, and that happens in June and July, and we've been doing that since 2016. And we have about 25 students who come down each year for that program. And this year, I have 4 master's students, a PhD student, and a GloCal student, all who are being mentored by me. And you can ask Vincent, that doesn't tend to leave a ton of time for all of the students, but it's just something that happens kind of in conjunction with everything else. And also here at Cayetano, I'm a member of the IRB, and I've been a member of the IRB since about 2015. And sometimes that is very helpful, and sometimes it feels like a large time commitment, but it does help for knowing how the IRB works and being able to figure out how to get studies through and approved pretty quickly, which is part of why I keep doing it. So just moving on to the next slide, if there aren't any questions, I wanted to talk a little bit about funding, because one of the things I think is really hard is how to figure out where to get your funding from. And this is true for Americans and for international students. I actually just had a former colleague come by and talk to me yesterday about what she should do strategically about applying for grants, because it's not easy to figure out. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I did. I mentioned that I have an F-31, and the F-31 was for my dissertation work, so I don't know if there are any pre-doctoral students, but an F-31 is funded by the NIH. Different different institutes do fund F-31s. Mine was from the NIMH, but there are different institutions that have it available, and it's specifically for dissertation work. The T-32s are really very common training programs that a lot of US universities have, and they fund postdocs. And the rules for the NIH are basically that you can have postdoc funding for up to 3 years. Some postdocs are now longer than that even. And it's a nice way to finish your PhD and then have funding. And a lot of them are not just for doctoral students, but also for MDs who are interested in research. And a lot of them, especially for MDs, come with additional training that you can get so that you can get a master's degree and be able to be more involved in the design and analysis side of research. During my postdoc, I worked on other projects as well. So I worked on an R34, which is, an R34 is kind of a midpoint between something very short, like an R21, which is 2 years, and something longer and more in depth, like an R01, which is 5 years. An R34 is 3 years, and the idea is that you use that time to get preliminary data and design an R01. And that's exactly what we did. And we now have that R01 funded, and I work on that as well. During my postdoc, I also took part in a sentinel surveillance study in 2011, which was just in Peru, funded by the Peruvian government to figure out about the level of HIV infection among key populations here, which are MSM and transgender women. And I worked with a team on that study while I was on the T-32. And part of what I want to point out in this is even during the KO1, which is, the KO1 is the next piece of my funding, and it's very nice because it gives you 5 years of salary support, which is almost unheard of in the research world, because it's 5 years of like complete funding. Even when I had the KO1, I didn't only do that. I knew that I had to continue to work on other studies, because if you only do something like a KO1, at the end of 5 years, you have zero support. So I knew that I wanted to continue to work with other people while I was on the K, so that I could build up grant support slowly as I got to the end of my K. And that's essentially what I'm doing now. So I had the KO1 from 2013 to 2018. It just finished. During that time, I also had GloCal. So when I had GloCal, I was actually a junior faculty. And it's a little bit different from having GloCal when you're either a pre-doctoral student or a postdoctoral student. I actually had it as junior faculty. But it provided additional funding and time to be able to do the preliminary work for the K. And then I had, so there's somebody who there, thank you. Then we had 2 R01s, an international R01 and the beginning of the R01 that was the extension of the R34 that I mentioned. And I worked on those as an unlisted co-I. So I didn't have salary support, but I had research support, I had support additional, and that allowed me to continue to work while I was on the K on these projects and to continue to be involved in other research so that once I hit the end of my K, I would have something there to support me. So right now, those have led into 2 R01s that I have now. So as it says on the slide, the K01 is this blessing and curse. It's wonderful because you have 5 years of funding, but if you don't continue to work on other things, you just fall off a funding cliff and have nothing after those 5 years. So that's why I knew that I wanted to continue to work on other things in the meantime and keep those going as I moved towards the end of the K. So now at the end of the K, I am a co-I on 2 R01s and also a large unit aid funded study to look at PrEP implementation in Peru. And I'm a co-I on each of those. And it may seem like I'm just talking about a whole bunch of alphabet soup. So if that's true, please ask me questions if you're not sure what I'm talking about. So then we come to, where does support come from? And I have had GloCal supported by the NIH, it's supported by Fogarty, but there are lots of other institutes at the NIH, and I've mostly had funding from 3. I've had Fogarty funding in the GloCal, I've had NIMH funding for a couple of R01s and the R34 and also my K award, and then I've also had funding from NIAID, which is another NIH institute, and they funded they funded one of the R01s that I've been working on. But usually NIH funding is pretty hard. And I'm sure that especially those of you who have tried to be involved in grant writing, you're going to hear a lot about funding lines and the long process, the amount of time it can take to get funded. And all of that is pretty hard to deal with. It's hard to have this very soft funding where 7 to 10% of applications actually receive funding. You may receive funding, but you might receive it after 2 or 3 years because you have to reapply and reapply and reapply, changing your idea to be able to conform to what the reviewers want and also to the changing science. So given that, there are several key things. One is establishing and maintaining collaborations. I have collaborations with people at both institutions that I'm involved in, so UCLA and Cayetano, but also at UCSF, also at other Peruvian research organizations like Impacta, Imensa, the Peruvian government. We have to keep relationships going so that we have study sites, so we have to keep the relationships going also with the Ministry of Health and the different sites that we work with within the Ministry of Health, which are, for me, they're primarily STI and HIV prevention clinics, hospitals that provide HIV care as well. But it's also important to look for, in addition to the collaborations, to look for other sources of funding. So I've had funding from not only the NIH, but also the WHO, from UNAIDS, from UnitAid, which is kind of a subsidiary of UNAIDS, from CFAR. CFAR are they're centers for AIDS research, and they're funded at US universities, and they have pilot funding for small projects to get started. And essentially they're small projects to then be able to apply for something larger at the NIH, like an R01 or an R21. I've also had funding from the Peruvian Science Foundation, from the Peruvian Ministry of Health, from the University of Hawaii. One of those things, like, you think poster sessions are silly at conferences, and then after one poster session, I was contacted by a researcher at the University of Hawaii, and we conducted a pilot study last year and are now applying together for an R01. So sometimes those poster sessions are actually very useful. And we've also had funding from industry. And usually that comes in the form of donated tests to be able to be used. We don't usually apply for much other funding than that, but it does help when you have small budgets to be able to have your test kits donated. And as I mentioned, even while I was on the K01, I knew that I had to maintain those collaborations. So that's why I had a lot of other projects going on during the K01 to not get paid on those grants, but to maintain those collaborations, keep myself involved in those research processes, be involved in grant writing for the subsequent grants, and make sure that I was on those grants post the K with actual support. So that's what I've been able to do, and it's really meant a great deal in terms of finishing my K in June and being able to have funding there from research projects that could pick up and support my salary. Because it is one of the very stressful things, especially if we kind of divide within health research, we kind of divide into these two camps, clinicians and non-clinician researchers. And I am a non-clinician researcher. And if you are a researcher, what you really want to do is have protected time to do research. That requires funding. And when you don't have funding, you have to turn to other sources for support for yourself. If you're a clinician, that often means clinical time. And if you're a non-clinician, that usually means teaching. And both clinical time and teaching are great to support your salary when you don't have enough research funding to be able to do so. But at the same time, they're huge time commitments that don't let you build up to getting more research funding. So you do have to balance, like, how much are you going to put into, if you're a clinician, clinical time, and if you're a non-clinician, teaching time, and still be able to work toward what you want, which is actual research funding. So I did want to talk a little bit about the assets that I bring to the table. So one of them is access to study populations. As I mentioned, I've lived in Peru since 2004. And that means that I have a tremendous amount of solid working professional relationships here that I can draw on when we have studies. So I know the NGOs I can go to, the clinics I can go to, the research organizations and researchers that I can go to when we have new research ideas, to be able to enroll participants and have participants be readily available to the research studies. And that's hugely important. I mean, one of the main problems with most research studies is slow enrollment. When you don't have, you may have a wonderful idea, but you may not be able to get enough people to enroll in the time allotted. And so having those ongoing working relationships in place is really key to getting research studies up and running. The second piece is, I mentioned that my doctorate is in infectious disease epidemiology, and that means that I have analytic skills that I can really rely on to get a lot of analysis done and paper writing done. And Paul mentioned at the beginning that I have over 60 publications. If you look at them, you might notice that the vast majority of the publications, I'm second author. I often have not been first author, I've usually been second author, and that's usually because what I've done is the data analysis. It doesn't mean I only do the data analysis. I help to direct the paper, I help to write the paper, but mostly my role has been the analysis piece. And so that is something that, it's a skill that I've been able to harness to really be able to try to get a lot of publications done and to work with those publications toward new research. One of the things that's really important in the research world is to be able to have publications that you can then use to set up your arguments for future funding of your ideas. And that's just one of those pieces that you absolutely need to have to be able to get future funding. And I mentioned also that, when I applied to my master's degree, I was a little bit wary of whether or not I would be able to do the stats part. And what I realized was that I actually really I don't like math, I don't like calculus, but I do like applied statistics. And that's essentially what I do. So I do a lot of applied data analysis. And once the numbers actually had meaning, that was really exciting. So one of my favorite things to do is analysis and data, and do the analysis for publications that we need and get them done so that we can use that data for future studies. And it is something that I like, and it is a skill that I can draw on for the research groups that I work with. The other piece is language and cultural skills. A lot of you actually you're international scholars, you are working in the place where you are from, and that makes life a lot easier because you know the context incredibly well. When you have global health researchers who are trying to work from abroad or trying to work in a context that they're not as familiar with, it tends to be a little bit bumpier. And you generally need a lot of time to really incorporate yourself within a research unit, a clinical unit. I mean, just to get the amount of work done that you need to get done to be a good researcher takes a lot of time and commitment, and not having language and cultural skills would make that very difficult. I spoke Spanish before I moved here, but not Peruvian Spanish, although I do now, and I'm at this point entirely fluent in Peruvian Spanish. And also the 14 years here mean that I'm pretty culturally competent. There are still differences. I will always be an American living in Peru. I'm not a Peruvian citizen, and it is different. But it does mean that I have the longevity of connections, and I understand the culture well enough to be able to maintain those connections in a way that's useful for projects and useful professionally. And the other fun part now is I've been doing this for long enough that former students are now collaborators. And it's wonderful to see former master students go on to the PhD students go on to their careers. I have a lot of US mentees who've come and worked with me either via the university, through research funding at UCLA, or through our research projects, and continuing those relationships and having those as a background for getting papers done, getting analysis done, but also then watching people as they grow through their career is really satisfying. And the other thing that you'll realize is that research is a very small world. So you end up running into people again and again. And that's really useful, but it can also be, you want to make sure that you keep that in mind and work towards building bridges and maintaining them more than anything else. So I also wanted to touch on family a little bit. You'll notice that I have not lived in the US for 14 years, so I actually have a very different take on family and how it's fit into my life and my career than I think is in the States. although I've never had kids in the States, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. I have a lot going on. I work quite a bit, and I do have 2 kids, a dog, a husband, and all of them have been born since, well, not my husband, but my children were, my first was born at the final year of my PhD, and my second was born while I was a postdoc. And those were great times to have kids, especially here. I really don't know how I would do it in the States. I have friends in the States and their kids have to go to daycare from 7:30 in the morning to 6:30 at night to be able to get the amount of work done that we do. And here I have a nanny and a housekeeper, which is completely the norm for kind of professional class here in Peru, but absolutely would not be possible if I were in the US. But it means that I can work to the extent that I need to be able to get all my projects done. I include a bit of travel. When I teach from 6, and that's, it couldn't difficult out of this context. But here, it very both cognizant of and also appreciative of. So I'm not sure how much that helps in terms of people who might be going back to the States, but this has been a really wonderful place to live and have a career and have all of it fit together and work. So it's something I very much appreciate. So I also wanted to just end with some of the things that I see in global health as inequities. And a lot of them are things that we don't tend to think about. And one of those is F&A. I have no idea if you guys know what F&A is, but F&A is what you might call overhead or indirect costs. And for US institutions, especially private universities, most institutions have a level of indirect costs that are over 50%, which means that if I get a grant at one of those institutions for $100,000, they get $50,000 plus. Doesn't touch my research money, it's what they get on top of my research money. For international institutions, unless they have a specific relationship with the NIH, that is capped at 8%. Okay? And usually that doesn't actually cover the cost of research administration. So think about this in terms of ethics committees, library access, grants administration, admin, facilities, like the actual cost of having buildings and electricity and computer systems. All of those are covered in the US by these huge overheads that these US institutions get. And I benefit from that because I have library access at UCLA. I have grants administration at UCLA. And they are supported by these huge overheads. Whereas if I bring grant money to Cayetano, they don't get that kind of support. So as we work in global health and work with international institutions, and I often hear frustration, for example, with ethics committees at international institutions and how they're not as organized, not as fast, etc. Please keep this in mind. They do not receive the level of support that US institutions do. And it's something that we really should have in our heads as we wade through the world of global health. The other thing is training opportunities. Right now, you guys are all funded under Fogarty. And Fogarty is one of the only parts of the NIH that provides funding for international fellows. The NIH provides funding for all researchers, no matter where they're from, as long as it's the best of the best. That's what they fund. They don't fund US institutions necessarily. But for training, most of the training dollars do go to US institutions. So the only reason that I was able to get a K is because I'm a US citizen. There is an equivalent of a K for international fellows within Fogarty, but they fund very few per year. And only one person from Latin America in the past 5 years, who's Larissa Otero, who's also a GloCal alum, was awarded a K. So there just aren't very many, which is unfortunate. And I think we all hope that Fogarty continues this training program, but could also expand training programs. But it's one of the things that means that international collaborations often don't have the same level of student support that you can find in the US, because there just aren't the same number of master's, doctoral, postdoctoral students who can support research the way that you find in the United States. The other thing is salary. So US institutions have very clear rules about salary and what people are paid, and that is not necessarily true in international institutions. And international institutions tend to have lower salaries than US institutions. So it's something that I have to keep in mind in terms of my salary and what I get paid. And when I have projects at UCLA, I get paid with a very different salary base than when I have projects at Cayetano. And it's just something that I try to keep in mind in terms of collaborators, socioeconomic status, opportunities, and all of those things that are important to just have in your head when you're working internationally. And then there's also a lot of issues of, all of the background in terms of training, salary support, all of it leads to shortfalls in terms of true collaboration. So when I talk to US students, what I say is, if you're interested in global health, please go find collaborators where you're really working with them as a collaborator. You're not I very much advise against doing parachute research. So showing up, doing all the research, getting all your data, and then going back to the US and analyzing it all on your own. That's not something that's useful. It's not really collaboration. You're not really adding to the global health knowledge base. You're just doing something that's very siloed. But at the same time, having true global health collaborations is difficult, because you really do need people who have the level of training and skills and ability to add to research. But it's something that we should actively work towards, and that's something that Fogarty does work towards, which is wonderful. But in that, think about some things. So I don't think that global health collaboration works very well of the for US, for example. The other thing is, when you have students come in often what happens is students from the first world have many more opportunities, and so a lot of them come without real skills to be able to add to a team. And then what happens from global health settings is often brain drain, where you have the best and the brightest, and where do they go? They go to the US and to Europe for additional training, and they may not come back. And the difference of that is really stark, and something that I think that we really do need to work towards ending. And a lot of that does come with training and opportunities in international settings. And the other thing is, sometimes there's differences of taking credit. And I think that non-low and middle income researchers have to be really cautious and cognizant of the level of support they're giving to an LMIC research organization, and make sure that they only take credit as it is actually due. So sometimes I see things like, oh, I'm the director of an NGO or a lab program in a remote place, and there's no check on that. And I think you should really only be able to claim that if you would claim it if that research organization were also in, the next state and not in a different continent. So just some things to keep in mind that I do run into as inequities in this very complex and small world of global health. So I've talked for a long time. Do you guys have any reactions or questions? Anything that you would like to hear more about? Have you heard all of this before?
In case you want to ask your question via the chat, you can as well. But please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your questions.
Hey, Nelson here. Hi, Kalinka. Interesting talk. I was particularly interested in parachute researchers. I've kind of noticed that the impression that potential collaborators in low-income countries get when sometimes you get an international or maybe a student or maybe an investigator who sort of shows up, collects data, and then the next time you hear about it's a published paper or something like that. How would you advise researchers in low-income countries to sort of negotiate the power dynamics in that space to kind of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's something that happens quite a bit. And I think there are a couple of things to do. One of the things is when somebody comes from the US, it is often their primary goal to essentially, during their collaboration, have a publication be their final product. And I think that's something that should be understood and set out from the outset. So one of the first things that you should do with the student when they come to you is say, okay, what are your goals for your time here? And a publication is great and it can be mutually beneficial, but that should be something that's like a conversation with both parties, so that as an international researcher, you have some input in that publication, where it goes, what what's written, what data are actually analyzed. You want to make sure that this, the international researcher isn't publishing something that you actually thought you were going to publish somewhere else, or with a different set of people involved in authorship. But I think it's just something that should be set up from the beginning. And I mean, really what we see in terms of visiting students is, yes, they want publications, but you really do have to set the rules and regs around that. And part of what I say to students as well is, it's great that you want a publication, but you may not finish it. And if you don't finish it by the time you're done, I need to be able to continue with it. So I try to have students leave, their cleaned databases, their statistical files, so that I can continue with that because often students go back to whatever, they go back to med school, they go back to finishing a doctoral program, and they probably don't have time. And you don't want to have it be that half of your data analysis is done, is computer files away. Really about what they have to leave as well. So they're not going to, and clear rules about timelines as well. Don't know that they're going to get it done by the second they leave. That's fine. But at the same time, if nothing's happened with it in a year, then there have to be different decisions made. But it's not easy, and it's definitely something that has to be broached.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Konda. We have one question from Vincent. He asks, Hi, Kalika, can you expand on what students from high-income countries can do better with regard to team building in LMICs, or what you've seen students do well in the past?
Really, I think the most successful students tend to really try to incorporate themselves within the research team, which isn't always easy. But understanding who your counterparts are, who you should be working with, how to really be present in meetings and work toward maintaining and kind of growing those relationships is really important. And it isn't easy, especially if you have language barriers. It's something that's definitely a challenge. But at the same time, it's just incredibly important so that you don't have it feel to people like, oh wow, they just came and took all this data and published all on their own. You really want people to feel like they're part of the process as well. So I think figuring out how to be, you really can't be completely outside of the office and not go. Part of it is just being around and making sure that people understand what you're working on, what your milestones are, how you're moving forward, how things are going. All of that helps you to incorporate yourself within the team. But it's not easy.
He says, thank you.
Okay. Okay, are there any other questions?
I have a question. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Becky. I'm in Rwanda, and I'm doing oncology-related work. And I'm sorry if you answer this, but my connection is a little unstable. But do you have any suggestions for how to kind of mitigate this discrepancy in the FNA? Allowable FNA costs and budgets when we're applying for grants? Are there ways to kind of actually budget for these more supportive services in a grant budget for your lower middle, your LMIC partners?
Yes, so there are a couple of things. So the first is, and this probably only applies for a couple of organizations, but once you start getting over, so I don't remember what the cutoff is, but once organizations start getting over a certain amount of money per year, they can actually apply to have their real FNA covered. And Cayetana is actually currently supposed to be in that process. And as far as I can tell, it takes years and years and doesn't go anywhere very quickly. But it is, so the NIH says that the cap is 8% unless you're such a big research organization that you're actually going to get a ton of funding, and then you can apply to have a larger part of that be, to have your FNA be a higher limit. But as I've said, like, I've known that this has been going on in Cayetana for a couple of years at least, and it hasn't finished yet. So it seems like a very long and entailed process. And it's really for organizations who are getting like more than a couple of $1 million a year in funding from the NIH. For other organizations, that's probably not the norm. For other organizations, basically what you can do is you need to be able to fund, it's called above the line, right? So like fund in your direct funds what you would be normally receiving in your indirects. So that means that you need to justify and make, so you need to justify like, we actually need additional admin support. We actually do need to have all of these supplies. We actually do need to have costs for the IRB. We actually do need to have all of that in your direct costs. And usually the costs are not, tremendously high, but it's important to take that into account, because in a US organization, they may say, well, why do you need another admin person? All of that's just funded from grant support. And that might be true in the US organization, but it won't be true in your LMIC organization. So it's really key to figure out what's missing, what do you need, and how to incorporate it within the actual direct funds of your budget. But it's definitely something that can be done, but it really needs to, it requires thought process at the outset.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, just to go back to the career stuff, because there are a couple of questions about this in the chats. So is there anything that I would have done differently in my career trajectory? Probably not. I feel incredibly lucky to have had the beginning of the career that I've had. And it's always kind of worked out that, as soon as I got to the end of my T32 funding, the K was funded. I got to the end of my K, we just got an R01 funded in September that covers at least some of my salary. One of the things that somebody said to me a few years ago, just in passing, but I was talking about work, and they said, how's work going for you? And I said, oh, it's going great. There's just a lot to do. And she looked at me and said, you're in academia. Of course there's a lot to do. You could work 24/7 the rest of your life and there'd still be stuff to do. And it's true. I mean, what I tell my advisees is, if you feel like you don't have enough to do, you've forgotten something, because there's always something you could be doing. And it's absolutely true in research. I could work 24/7 and not get everything done, because we're trying to improve health and policy and publish and get grants. There's just so much. And so you have to build in balance. You have to build in time outside of the office, because I don't want to be in here every waking minute of every day. And I've managed to have my career be successful without having to work that much. I do work a lot, but I do try to have it be in balance with what I can, also have an outside private life. But I don't wish to have done anything differently. I will say I don't know how I would have done this in the US. I really don't. I think that living in a place where it is completely expected that I would take time for family, take time to have children, and that was just an expected part of the process, has been really nice. And I feel lucky in that, and that I've been able to do that. And that my kids didn't have to be in daycare 12 hours a day. I think that would be really hard. So I'm very appreciative of that piece. But there's nothing really career-wise I would have done that differently. Any other questions? I know you guys are all in very different places, and it's different to be a researcher from the US versus not from the US. And then every country has their own funding mechanisms that you also have to figure out the likelihood of solely being funded via something like the NIH for your entire career, that's hard. So keep your eyes open for other sources of funding that can be helpful along the way. Any other questions?
I think. Any questions in the chat?
Not really.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Konda. This has been really insightful and really helpful.
Absolutely. It's nice to talk to all of you. Thank you for coming and listening to me.
Thanks for having us and for the great talk and for appreciating the LMIC environment that helped you do well.
Thank you. And definitely, if anybody has questions, Paul has my email, and you can get in touch with me as well. But this has been fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.